Alrighty, hello and welcome to the 6th of 6 faculty development workshops as part of the Cybersecurity Faculty Development Grant at the UCCS College of Business. These workshops are designed to help cybersecurity faculty and aspiring faculty get the training they need to advance in their careers. And for this presentation, we welcome Megan Stid, PhD, our Assistant Dean for External Relations and for Student Career Exploration in the College of Business. Dr. Stid works with students regularly in her role, and she has advanced knowledge of the topic at hand. These presentations are being recorded and will be available online by continuing in this session. All attendees consent to be recorded, but we will not be posting chat logs online or anything of that nature. With that in mind, if you would not like to be recorded, now's the time. And we'll, at this point, turn it over to Dr. Stid.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you all for joining me today for tips and tricks for interviews for cybersecurity faculty. As Michael said, my name is Dr. Megan Stid, and I am here in the College of Business where I oversee our career curriculum. So I have over 20 years of experience working with students and helping them prepare for their careers after graduation, and I'm excited to do the same for you today. To get started for the agenda, we'll be covering quite a few topics today, including the interview process, types and styles of interviews, etiquette considerations, and general tips for interview success. So if along the way you have questions, please type them in the chat or feel free to interrupt me. So I wanted to start today with just a general overview of the process, as it's very helpful for you to understand what the application process looks like. Of course, the process starts once you submit your CV and supporting materials. If you're a good fit for the role, you'll receive a call or an email for an initial interview. And this interview is typically done virtually or over the phone. And if the first interview is successful, you'll advance to the second round of interviews. So there may be a second round, or you may advance directly to the final interview. The number of steps in the interview process depends on the number of qualified candidates and the process at that specific institution. So it might just be a first round straight to a final round, or it might be first, second, final rounds. Just depends on the particular search. And the final interview is when you can expect a reference check and some type of a research presentation, which we'll talk about a little later. And if all goes well, you'll receive a verbal offer, complete a background check, and receive the official written offer. And at that point, congratulations, you're officially hired. So today we're going to talk specifically about that initial interview, what the final interview could look like, and that research presentation. So kind of the middle portion of this process is what we will address today. So I wanted to spend some time talking about the different formats for an interview. There's generally three types of virtual interviews. So we're going to talk about virtual interviews first. And this is what you initially see in a first round interview. It is typically done virtually. And honestly, since COVID, even the in-person interview formats or the final interviews may be done virtually as well, just depending on the institution. But for the virtual interviews, there's generally three types. The first would be a two-way dialogue by phone. So this is kind of the old school way of doing things. You actually are on the telephone doing a two-way dialogue. And these types of interviews have a very long-standing history in our culture. So whether it's a recruiter calling for a preliminary interview, or a hiring manager spending an hour or more in discussion with you, or a group of panelists from a search committee where they're all on the line at the same time, the phone interviews are considered a type of a virtual interview. The second type is a two-way video. So this is what we're very comfortable and familiar with in our program. So this is similar to the phone interview, but it's done over a video service like Zoom or Teams. So that's the two-way video. And the third type is a one-way video. So in this model, candidates are often prompted to answer pre-recorded questions that appear on the screen. So it's an AI, an artificial intelligence that is doing this interview with you. So essentially you're interviewing with the computer, and it's built to decipher what you're saying and to make judgments about your skills. And it may also be watching you to gain insight into your nonverbal communication. And these type of interviews are becoming more common in higher education searches. You would generally find this specifically in engineering and business fields, but it's possible that your first round interview is really going to be with an AI rather than with a real person. And we've started using this at the University of Colorado with a system called HireView. So our first round of interviews are often these AI interviews. So don't be surprised if you get an email asking you to do an AI interview for your first round. All right, now that we kind of have an idea of what the format of the interview might look like, let's define the types and styles of interviews that you can expect. So you might have a one-on-one meeting with a hiring manager, or perhaps it's with you and 5 to 10 others, which can be classified as either a panel or a group interview. You may be in an interview where there are several candidates in the same room answering questions from interviewers or managers, though this style is really not common in higher education. It'll typically be you one-on-one or you with a group of interviewers. And the interviews can be everything from casual to being more formal in nature. And this is really important for you to understand the culture of the organization where you plan to interview. Because some organizations, some colleges and universities are just more casual than others. So interview styles will vary. And in many cases, you're going to participate in a variety of these interviews, all within the same interview process, right? So you can expect some panel interviews, you can expect some one-on-one interviews, you can expect some formal ones, maybe a more casual one where you go out to coffee or have lunch with someone. So you might see all of these within the interview process. So let's talk a little bit about interview styles as well. So we'll start with behavioral interviewing, or what's known as situational interviewing. And it's the most common form of interviewing today. So in this model, candidates are asked a question about a specific time in their past that can answer the question. For example, they might say, give us an example of a time when you did not get along with a coworker, or tell us about a time when you went above and beyond the scope of your job description. Whenever you hear the words time when or example of, it's a behavioral interview question. So they're going to evaluate your response based on what is known as the STAR method, which stands for situation, task, action, and result. So they're going to want to hear specifically, what did you do in that situation? What tasks were involved, the actions that you took, and the end results. And when you answer these questions, make sure that you're talking about what you did rather than what a team or a group did, because the interviewers want to know specifically about your skill set. So it can be a team or a group project, but talk about what you did in that situation and what the results were that you helped achieve. It's okay. It's always best for this to be a really positive experience, but it is okay to talk about a time that maybe didn't go so well. And they might ask you, it's like, tell me about a time when you failed. So you might have to talk about a time when something didn't go as planned. But at the end of it, make sure to share what you learned from it and how you do things differently in the future. So it shows that you're reflecting on your past experiences and that you're able to improve moving forward. Another common question style is opinion or subjective in nature. So these are questions like, how would you handle conflict in the workplace? Or what would you do in this specific situation? These questions are more theoretical, and they differ from behavioral questions because they're not phrased for you to offer a very specific time when you had to handle conflict. They just want to know generally, how would you handle conflict in the workplace? So in those questions, you don't have to have a specific example. You can just say what you would do or what your opinion is on that situation. You might see stress tests or technical aptitude questions depending on where you're applying. So they could give you a situation and you have to come up with a solution, or it within a set amount of time, or they might ask you to complete some type of assessment. So if you're applying for a technical role and you have put down that you have very specific technical skills, be prepared because they might have an aptitude test to test that. So regardless of the type or style of interview, you want to ensure that you're taking care in handling yourself and surroundings. So these are some general etiquette considerations. First, you want a background that's free from distraction. So a recruiter, they don't want to see a messy bed objectionable posters or statements, clutter, family members or TV that's on in the background. All of those things are very distracting. So ensure you're in a quiet space without any background noise. Things like traffic, birds, children, pets, radios, they can all be very distracting, and they might be louder on the other end than they are to you. So make sure when you're doing a virtual interview that everyone in your household is aware that you are on an interview and that you cannot be inadvertently accessed by pets, children, roommates, spouses, etc. And you also want to think about unintentional disruptions, like really bright shining lights from behind, or even being in a dark space without enough light. These can make it very difficult for the person to see you and may leave them with a lack of confidence in your candidacy for the role. So your camera position and distance should result in a clear frame of view from about the shoulders up. You want to try and use your built-in microphone, but if you have to use headphones or earbuds, that's okay if needed. And you want to make sure that you're in a place with a good internet signal so the call is not dropping in and out. And an important thing to remember, regardless of style, is to use the same etiquette that you would as if you were in a face-to-face interview, physically sitting with someone in front of you. So look at the camera for good eye contact, stay professional with your language, and dress professionally as well. If you can have notes if you need them, but it's best to have those displayed on a computer screen rather than having papers that you need to fumble with. And finally, remember that sometimes technology doesn't work. And if this is the case, if you get on a virtual interview and the technology is not working appropriately, it's really important to stay calm, do what you can to communicate with the organization. So send them an email, give them a phone call, whatever that looks like. And if you don't have a backup option, just make sure that you're communicating and talking to the organization. This shows that you're able to handle a stressful situation with grace. So you don't need to panic if the technology isn't working. So here are some other etiquette considerations to think about when you're applying for roles. Make sure you have a professional voicemail greeting. So with a generic system, when it just has your phone number or it says the caller cannot be reached at this time but doesn't have your name on it, recruiters are not sure if they have the right number, and sometimes they might not leave a message if they can't confirm that it's the right person. So for your voicemail greeting, make sure that it's either, it's done by you with at least your first name. That's very appropriate. Children, music, or anyone other than yourself on your voicemail should be, those types of greetings should be avoided when you're in the middle of the job search. One trick that I like to tell everyone who's looking for work is you can establish a Google Voice account and you can create a greeting for that account, and you'll get a phone number that you can give out specifically to recruiters. So when you get a call on the Google Voice number, you know that that's a company that's wanting to call and recruit you, hire you, put you through the next step in their interview process. And that dedicated number can be very helpful so that you can have a very specific voicemail greeting and you know that it's an employer trying to call you. Make sure that your voicemail isn't full. So we get that often too. We'll call somebody to schedule an interview and the voicemail is full. So make sure to clear it daily, and make sure you respond to your voicemails and emails from employers quickly. Sometimes the amount of time it takes you to respond may be part of that evaluation process. And always attempt to send a thank you note. So jot down the interviewers' names, look for them on an agenda if you received them. You can look in the people section of a virtual platform. So if it's online through Zoom, you can jot their names down that way. You can always take their names down and look them up online at the university's website later. But an individual email to each person is really the best approach when you're interviewing. At a minimum, if you're not able to provide an individual email to each person participating, then a thank you email to at least the search committee chair is warranted, and ask them to share that thank you note with the others involved. So make sure you're sending out thank yous when you're done with your interview process. Okay, so now let's talk about how you can prep for the interview a little bit. So you're going to want to research the institution beforehand to demonstrate knowledge of who they are, what they do, who they serve, and perhaps something that sets them apart and interests you. So you also must understand the position for which you are interviewing. One common mistake made by job seekers is not saving the job description at the time of application. So it's really important, if you are applying for a role, make sure that you save a copy of the job description. Several organizations, many organizations, they'll remove that job posting once they begin the hiring process. So I would hate for you to apply for a job today. In 3 or 4 weeks, you get a call to interview and you can't find the job description and now you don't know what to expect. So the best is to save a copy of it on your computer. It's not enough to just rely on the link because that link might no longer work when your interview comes around. So print it out as a PDF file or save it somewhere on your computer so that you definitely have a copy of that posting. So you also want to make sure that you understand the job itself and the transferability of skills that you have. So how does everything you have done work-wise in your academic career, maybe in volunteer experience that you've had, how does all of that give you the skills necessary to do that job? So for example, maybe you've never had to deal with a student in crisis before. Maybe that's something that you haven't had to do, but perhaps you learned how to do that in a class, or you had to, help unruly customer in a job, right? That would be a transferable skill that you could help a student in crisis. So use these skills to demonstrate what you can do. Think about what you've done and how it relates to that particular role. Before you go into an interview, see if you can gain some insights on the question that might be asked, or at least the style. So Glassdoor, especially for private roles, is a great resource for identifying interview experiences from others. So the question might always, and another thing to think about is what you're being asked might not always be measuring what you think it's intended to measure. So for example, a recruiter might ask a candidate to tell them about a time they disagreed with their supervisor. In this case, they're not only looking for how the candidate handles conflict, but how do they incorporate the established policies and procedures of their organization into their thought process, or into this disagreement. So sometimes they're trying to measure a couple different things and it might not be necessarily what you think it is. Recruiters and managers also listen to what you don't say. So they generally have some thought as to the direction your response should go to meet their needs. And if it doesn't, or if you leave out details, they may either ask you more follow-up questions, or even worse, they might make false assumptions about your skill or ability. So make sure you're really listening to the question and addressing what they've asked you. And it's okay for you to ask at the end of the question, did I answer your question completely, or was there anything that I missed in that question? Most interviews will always end in what questions do you have for us? And please don't say, I don't have any questions at this time. That's one of the worst things you can do. So come prepared with at least a few questions. You can ask about the company culture. You can ask about the interviewer's favorite and least favorite aspect of the work. There's lots of different, if you have any points of clarification for that specific job, like you're not sure about a very specific component of the role, that would be a great time to ask it. Just make sure that you've pulled a couple different questions out that you can ask at the end of each interview. And it's best if you can tie your questions to what you need to know to make the decision if the organization is right for you. So this is not just the organization interviewing you. This is an opportunity for you to interview them and make sure that the role is a good fit. And the last thing I'll say about candidate questions, it is not appropriate to ask about the salary during an initial interview. That is something that is best to have a conversation about after the final interview or when a verbal offer is made. So the salary is not, I would not recommend approaching the salary topic at the very first interview for the role. So when interviewing, there's some common questions that you can expect. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So when interviewing, make sure that you maintain a professional demeanor by staying friendly with everyone who's involved. It's critical, though, that you're confident in what you know as well as what you don't know. So you will always want to focus on your strengths, but make sure that you're being honest about what you don't know, because it helps the organization determine if you're a good fit for them. So if you certainly don't want to pretend you know everything about the job, and then you walk in to the position and find that you can't perform it, which is not going to end well for you. And there's also companies that are willing to train, and they're just trying to understand your strengths and maybe where you're going to need some extra support. So make sure that you're honest about that. And I'll also leave you with this tip. So interviews are not all about you. So as I mentioned, you're also interviewing that organization to make sure it meets what you're looking for and needing in a workplace and a position. So make sure you're listening to the questions, you're observing the interactions, and pivot your responses as needed. And then make sure you're asking enough questions so that you have the information you need to make sure it's a good fit for you. Okay, so let's move on to some common questions that you can expect. So the questions asked during an interview, they're going to vary greatly depending on the role and the institution. That's why it's so important for you to research the institution and understand the role before going into the interview. But generally speaking, in a faculty interview, you can expect to be asked these different types of questions. So for a personal question, for example, you can always expect, tell me about yourself, or tell me about your career goals, or tell me what interests you about this position and why you think it's a good fit for you. So you should have a 30-second elevator pitch prepared that highlights your experience, why you're a good fit for the role, and why you are interested in that specific institution and that specific job. You should also be prepared to answer questions about your research. This is a faculty interview, and research is very important, especially if you're looking for a tenure track faculty role. So be prepared to answer questions about your research experience. Some examples, you'll want to be able to talk about what your research interests are and why and how those interests relate to the role at the institution. It's also common to be asked about your teaching philosophy or your teaching style. You're going to be teaching students at their institution, and they want to make sure that what you're bringing to the classroom aligns with the culture of their organization. So be prepared to discuss your teaching philosophy and why that is a good fit for that specific institution. Most institutions of higher education also have a commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion. So be prepared, you're probably going to be asked a diversity question. At UCCS, each search committee has a diversity champion, and during each step in the search process, a diversity question is asked, or some type of question that relates to equity, diversity, and inclusion. So some examples might include, what is your approach to understanding the perspectives of colleagues from different backgrounds? Or how have you modified your teaching and instruction to meet the needs of diverse learners in your classroom? So be prepared for some diversity questions. Lastly, it's very important for you to research the institution, as I've mentioned before. So as you may be asked questions that relate to the culture, the values, the mission, or the vision. So here at the UCCS College of Business, our core values are learners first, build community, and make a difference. So there are definitions of each one of these values on our website, and a candidate that understands these values and is able to address the values during the interview is a much stronger candidate than others who have applied and don't understand the values of our organization. So make sure you've done your research about the institution and you're able to understand their vision, mission, and values so you can talk about them in the interview. And even if you're not directly asked about the values or how your values align with the values of the university, you can weave them into other interview questions, or maybe that's why you're interested in the particular role or the particular institution is because your core values really align with the core values of the institution. So anywhere that you can weave that in is very beneficial and will make you a stronger candidate. Okay, so if you are selected as finalists for a faculty role, you will most likely be asked to create a research presentation. So the research presentation is designed to assess how you would fit in as a teacher, scholar, and colleague. This is also an opportunity for faculty, staff, and students who are not part of the survey to evaluate you and provide feedback to the hiring authority. So these presentations are used to evaluate your teaching style and philosophy, your research potential, and your communication skills. So this is your time to shine and really show your personality, your teaching style, and why that's a good fit for their institution. So let's talk a little bit more about these research presentations so that you can be a little more prepared when going in. So when preparing your presentation, first thing, must consider your audience. Are you presenting to faculty, staff, students, or a mix of all of them? Sometimes you'll be asked to speak about your specific research, or you may also be asked to provide a lecture to a course that they're expecting you to be able to teach. So it's really important for you to understand the expectations. Are you presenting in person? Are you presenting virtually? Are you presenting in a hybrid format? Are you presenting to students, or are you presenting about your own research? What's the length of the presentation? Presentations are typically capped at an hour to include time for questions. And you also need to really understand that expected content. So if you have any concerns about what to include in your presentation or who's in the audience, do not be afraid to ask whoever your contact is at that university. You want to make sure that you get the content of that presentation right, and you know who you're presenting to and what you are expected to present. If you're asked to share about your specific research, make sure that you include these items listed here. So you want to talk about the aim of your research study, how your research fills a gap in the current literature, and the outcomes of your research or the results of your research, and why your research is important. Why should they care about the research that you have done? So that's if you're presenting on your own research. If you're presenting to a group of students and they're asking you to teach a class, then you can ask for specific topics that they want covered in that course, maybe the textbook that they're using for the class. You can ask for additional supporting materials if you're asked to present as a guest lecturer in a classroom. So make sure that you understand what you're being asked to do for that presentation. Here's a couple of things for during the presentation and for the question and answer session. So for the presentation, during the presentation, be sure to look up from your notes, make eye contact with the audience, be clear and concise with your thoughts, make sure that you have practice and you know what you're going to say and you know when you're going to say it. So this is why it's really important to know your audience, because it allows you to adjust the content and prepare accordingly and ensure that the information you're sharing is of interest to those who are attending. Also, be prepared for technology to fail. It can happen. So make sure that you have notes and that you're ready to present without the technology if needed. Again, make sure you practice and stick to the time allotted. So for most research presentations, there's a limited amount of time and you will not have the option to run over. You'll simply be cut off at the time limit. So you want to ensure that you're able to complete your presentation and show them that you have some time management skills as well and you know how to follow those directions. You also want to make sure that you leave time for questions and discussion. So it's very important to allow for dialogue after your presentation, regardless of if it's a presentation about your research or if you're a guest lecturer. If it's a presentation about your research, you're going to want to give time for people to ask questions, learn more about what you're doing. And if you're presenting to students, you obviously want to make sure that students have time to ask you questions and points of clarification as well. So make sure you know the total amount of time that you have, how much time you have to present, and how much time you have Q&A. When you are asked questions, please consider these questions as constructive discussion rather than criticism that you need to deflect. Being argumentative will distract from the content of your research. So be open to constructive feedback from others. And if you're asked a question that you feel a little guarded or, you feel like you need to defend yourself, just try to take a deep breath and remember to be positive and consider it as constructive feedback during that interview. And just allow time for a natural dialogue to occur at that point. Okay, so two key things to remember in the interview process. It is so important for you to be authentic and honest during the interview. By being yourself, understanding what you have to offer to the organization and where you have room for development, and being honest and transparent about those items is key to a success in an interview. It's going to make sure that you're the best fit for that company, and that company is the best fit for you as well. So just make sure to be authentic and honest through the interview process. And I also know that waiting, especially for news if you got the job, can be really, really grueling. But it doesn't do any good to panic about the situation or worry about it. So try to stay calm and relaxed. And there are many factors that go into the decision to hire someone. Organizations have to make decisions about fit within the position, the culture, and how your skills to compare to other candidates. And this all takes a lot of time. So at the end of the interview, it's okay to ask about the timeline. If they don't offer it for you, you can ask when you can expect to hear. And if that timeline passes, it's okay to send an email or have a phone call and ask, where you're at in that process. But it's not appropriate to constantly email or call the employer asking for updates. So be mindful and make sure that you ask for a timeline and that you allow that timeline to pass before you follow up. And a simple email check-in is always the best first step. Also, please remember that reference checks can really take a lot of time as they're waiting for responses. So some of the processes, especially when working for public institutions, can take weeks or sometimes months. So this is going to take some patience on your end. Okay, now it's also true that you're unlikely to receive an offer from every job, right? And that's okay. Being true to yourself and ensuring you land at a place where you will be successful is the most important. So when a decline happens, and we've all been declined from a job. I think we've all been declined from a job before. I certainly have received declines. There's very often little or any feedback provided on what you could have done better, right? Companies are actually very cautious about providing too much feedback from your interview, so they don't want to have any legal repercussions from it. So I really encourage you after an interview to personally reflect on the process, how you responded, what other skills you may need to develop to help you be successful. And you can also do some mock interviews, practice interviews with friends, family. Ask someone who's working in the industry or a faculty member if they'll sit down and do a mock interview with you. The Career Center, or you're in the College of Business, then the Career Development Center, we offer mock interviews as well. So different, it's always good to practice. I also like to reflect and kind of before the interview and after the interview, I'll practice answering questions, especially that 30-minute elevator pitch that, I always have that ready to go before the interview. And I've always practiced it in front of the mirror. Or I've recorded myself on my computer and watched it back. So just make sure that you're preparing, you're practicing, and then after the interview, you're reflecting on that as well. So in closing, I offer you several resources for finding opportunities. So the Chronicle and Higher Ed Jobs both offer job boards with faculty roles. Handshake is the job platform we use here at the university, and we have over 4,000 positions for UCCS students and alumni right now, but a very small percentage of those are higher education based. The Chronicle and Higher Ed Jobs are much better for those types of opportunities, but you can always follow LinkedIn and Indeed as well. There's plenty of higher ed jobs that are posted there. I encourage you to think about specific universities or colleges that are a good fit for you and spend some time on their website, researching them and looking at their specific career pages. That's always a good way to go. And then of course, word of mouth. It's always important to build your network, get to know others in the industry, and then they'll reach out to you if there's a role that they think is a good fit for you. And with that, I will open it up to questions if anyone has a question that they would like me to answer. Oh, I see two chats. Hold on. Let me see. All right. So let's see, Google, can you create that? The appearance of a local, if you're moving into a new area or county, that's interesting. I'm not sure. I haven't had that question about Google Voice before. I believe it just gives you, I don't know that you can change the, I'm trying to look it up so I can answer you right now. I don't know if you can change the zip or the area code on that. I've never had anybody ask that question before. It looks like I have to install it to see. So I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that question, but it's definitely something I can look for you, Greg, and let you know if that can be done. And then your other question, if interviewers ask your salary requirements during an early interview, how do you avoid answering without turning them off? I guess so in the state of Colorado, they are no longer allowed to ask your salary as part of the interview process with the Equal Pay for Equal Work Act. They are not authorized to ask you that. So let me just spend a moment asking or talking about illegal interview questions. That brings up a very important.
They still do.
They're not supposed to. So let's talk about illegal interview questions because it comes up a lot. Because it's technically not legal for them to ask you about your family either, right? That they'll say like, oh, do you have kids or are you married? You know, in like casual conversation. So if they ask the question, so they ask you about your salary and you don't want to answer, I would, I usually say with the legal interview questions, you know, ask them about how does it relate to that role? And with the salary question, it gets a little tricky, but you could reword it and say, you know, I would love to know
what the salary range of the job is or something.
Well, yeah, like you can, if they say like, what was your past salary? I guess you could say, well, I would love to know how that relates to this particular job search and this particular role. Are you asking me if I'm comfortable with the posted salary range for the position? Or if they haven't posted, in Colorado, they're supposed to post a salary range, but maybe you're applying out of state where they don't require you to post a salary range or where it's not illegal. I mean, there are several states where it is still legal for them to ask you this.
I've had it asked many times in the last 6 months.
Okay, so what I would say is I would turn it on them and say, I would love to know how this is connected to, or how, I would love to know how this relates to this particular job search. Are you wondering if I'm comfortable with the salary range you're offering? And if so, what is the salary range you plan to offer for this role? And then you can answer whether or not you're comfortable with that salary range instead of giving them the salary that you have earned in the past. Because that should not, the salary you've earned in the past should not be connected to the salary that they're going to offer you. They should be offering you the appropriate salary range for that position based on your qualifications for the role. So that's how I would do it. Just simply say, you know, I think the intent of that question, you could even say that I believe the intent of your question is to understand if I'm comfortable with the salary range for this position. So you can either say at that time, I am comfortable with the range that was posted, or if it's not posted, you could ask, what is the salary range that you intend to offer for this role?
It's a very good, delicate dance.
It is.
You have to do.
It is. But I understand why, you know, because we used to, I've been on the recruiting side when people were providing their salary information. We obviously don't do it anymore, but it used to be asked on applications so you could see it if they put it in there. And so if someone was making a lot of money and then looking at a role that paid less, you know, you start to wonder, well, I wonder why that is. Or if they're making much lower salary, then it's like, oh, okay, well, we might not have to pay them as much, right? And so that's why in Colorado with the Equal Pay for Equal Work Act, they've nixed that and they're not allowed to do it. So, but if they're out of state, some out of state institutions are, I mean, it's not federal law, it's state law, right? So I can see where you may have been asked this question.
Well,
that's how I would handle it.
And a lot of employers don't post jobs in Colorado because of that law.
Yeah, they don't want to have to post the salary. Yeah, it's changed the landscape for sure, because it does bring into question, you know, now everybody within the organization can see what the salary range is for that role and where they fit on that range, right? So it's all about equity, and I think it's good overall, but it has caused caused some issues, and
it's caused a discrimination issue against Colorado employees.
Yeah. Well, I know they can post it on their job boards, and I think they can still post it on Higher Ed, Chronicles of Higher Ed, but it's if it's a Colorado role that's based in Colorado, they're gonna have to post the salary that goes with it. How have you been? I'd be interested. I mean, is that answer helpful where you any kind of a legal interview question?
Well,
like if they
I
ask,
haven't done it from a higher education role. It's all been
Okay.
for commercial jobs.
Okay, I gotcha.
But I have been asked that question many times.
Yeah, so I'd turn it on them. Any illegal interview question, if someone asks, like if I'm in an interview and they ask me, you know, I've had interviewers ask about my family obligations before. And I have said, like, can you please tell me how this relates to the specific job roles? Because, you know, they're not supposed to be asking about your family, and they'll say, oh, well, we just want to make sure that you have time for the travel commitment that goes with this role. And it's like, yes, I saw it was 30% travel and I'm comfortable with that. So it's more turning it back on, you know, I think the intent of your question is to understand if I'm comfortable with the salary range you're willing to offer. So what salary range will you be offering for this
What
role?
if you were applying to a religious university system and they asked what church you go to?
So religious institutions will often ask you to sign a statement of faith. So in that scenario, I would ask them, you know, I believe you're asking this question to ensure that I meet your statement of faith requirements. So can you tell me, like, what do you require in this statement of faith? And then they can usually, sometimes they're very specific and want you to be in a certain, you know, religion. And other times it's like, well, we just want to make sure that you believe in a higher being. So there's a really wide range in those religious institutions as to what they're looking for. So I would ask, rather than answer what church you go to, I would ask for clarification about their statement of faith policy, or what they are wanting in their employees when it came to religious beliefs. And then after they tell you what they need, then you can answer how you match that.
Okay. If you're unwilling to sign the statement like that, can that be considered discrimination? Or are religious universities allowed to demand that?
They're a private institution. If it's state institutions can absolutely not require you to sign any, obviously there's separation of church and state, right? But private universities and private schools can have you require you to sign a statement of faith.
Okay.
Yeah, but state, I mean, obviously that should never happen in a state school, but public institutions, I'll say that public institutions cannot have that requirement, but private ones can. Yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions?
No, it's a little early for me in this process. I'm, you know,
Okay.
partway through this DBA program and just starting to look down the path. And the other thing I ran into is some of the schools I've looked at are requiring you to have published in one of the top 8 IT journals, and as part of the interview requirements. And so I was just starting to explore that requirement of this.
Oh, what are the top journals and what do you need to, how do you need to publish in them?
They call it the basket of 8 journals for in information systems.
I'll tell you one thing that you are doing absolutely right, that I'm so glad you're doing right now, is looking at the positions that you want to have when you graduate with this EDBA, and seeing what the requirements are for them so that you can make sure you check the boxes, because people do not always do that. So it is great that you are spending some time on the job boards looking at the postings so that you know you're going to meet the qualifications when you graduate. So I'm really great job on doing that.
I'm even trying to decide on the dissertation topic, and it may very well be that I need to focus on a topic that would fall within the parameters of one of those 8 journals.
Sure.
You know, so maybe I don't get published, but it would just be within the scope of those journals.
Right. And so that goes back to the transferable skills where, you know, you're lining it up the best you can with the qualifications that you have. So that's great. And you have some faculty in the College of Business that have done quite a bit of publishing. So make sure that you're leaning on them and asking them, you know, how you could get published in one of those journals and what that might look like.
And I posted that in our cohorts Teams channel this week about this basket of 8 in the journals, and perhaps they should at least consider their dissertation topic being within the scope of those journals.
Yeah. No, that's great. I'm glad you were looking at that, and that make sure you utilize your faculty and to help with those, or see if you can definitely align your research in a way that'll work out for those.
Dr.
That's great.
Kosis is my dissertation chair.
Okay, great.
That's all
Any
I
other
have.
questions? That's all you
No.
have? Okay. Well, Greg, you know where to find me if you need anything. So
I do.
if you need help, let me know. And if you want to do a mock interview when you get to the point where you're ready, or if you want to, if you do get to the point where you're doing some research presentations and you want to run through it, I'd be happy to do that with you. I'm sure your faculty would too, but I'd be happy to help if you need it.
Okay. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks for coming today. It's always great
Okay.
to have you here. Thank you, Michael. I think
All right,
we're
thank
good.
you.
Yep.
Just as a formality, that concludes the sixth of six cybersecurity faculty development workshops. Thank you, Dr. Stid, for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom with us. It's worth noting as well that these will be posted online. Dropped a link in the chat to where those workshops will be located. As you watch this session, participants may also be interested in following up by viewing some of our previous workshops, which Dr. Stid's alluded to. So for example, we had a little piece in this presentation about writing, for example, a diversity statement or a teaching philosophy, where we do have full presentations on those as well on our website. So I encourage all participants who are interested in learning a little bit more to check out those workshops as well. But thank you, Dr. Stid, for your time. Thank you for all who attended, and I hope this resource is helpful.